There is a moment that arrives in every engineer's career when the confidence built from years of training, from countless projects completed and problems solved, collides with something that simply should not exist. And in that moment, standing in the climate-controlled vault of a museum basement, or holding a fragment of stone worn smooth by millennia, the engineer realizes that everything they thought they understood about human capability and the march of technological progress might be built on a foundation far more fragile than they ever imagined. Dr. Christopher Dunn experienced this moment in 1995, standing before a granite box in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, running his precision measuring instruments along its surfaces and discovering that the interior corners were machined to tolerances of 0.002 of an inch, a precision that modern machinists struggle to achieve with computer-controlled equipment. And this box, according to every historian and archaeologist who had studied it, had been carved more than 4,000 years ago by people who possessed only copper tools, wooden mallets, and an apparently inexhaustible supply of patience. The measurements didn't lie. The granite didn't lie. But everything Dr. Dunn had been taught about ancient Egypt, about the progression of human technology from crude to refined, from simple to complex, seemed to dissolve in the cool basement air as he documented angles and surfaces that shouldn't exist in a world where the ancient past was populated by primitive peoples slowly scratching their way towards civilization. This is where our story truly begins. Not in the well-lit galleries where tourists shuffle past treasures with audio guides explaining the official narrative, but in these moments of profound cognitive dissonance, when the physical evidence refuses to conform to the timeline we've constructed, when the artifacts themselves seem to whisper of capabilities that have been systematically written out of history books, because acknowledging them would require tearing down and rebuilding everything we think we know about who we are and where we came from as a species. We have been taught, with the certainty that only institutional education can provide, that human civilization began approximately 5,500 years ago in ancient Sumer, in the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the first cities rose from the mud and the first writers pressed wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets, recording grain inventories and royal decrees. And everything before that time was the realm of hunter-gatherers and Neolithic farmers, people who had mastered fire and agriculture, but who remained fundamentally primitive, incapable of mathematics beyond basic counting, incapable of engineering beyond stacking stones, incapable of understanding the cosmos beyond the recognition that the sun rose and set, and the seasons cycled through their eternal dance. This narrative, this baseline of human achievement that places Sumer at the origin point of everything we consider civilization, has become so embedded in our collective consciousness that to question it feels almost sacrilegious, like doubting gravity or questioning whether the Earth orbits the Sun. And yet, the physical evidence, the actual artifacts pulled from the ground and measured with instruments that cannot be fooled by wishful thinking or academic consensus, tells a different story entirely. A story that begins not 5,000 years ago, but 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, perhaps even further back into the mists of prehistory, when, according to every textbook and every museum placard, humans were supposed to be living in caves and hunting mammoths with sharpened sticks. The problem, the fundamental crack in the foundation of accepted history, is that these people, who weren't supposed to know anything beyond survival, who weren't supposed to have writing or mathematics, any form of sophisticated technology, left behind evidence of capabilities that rival and sometimes exceed what we can accomplish with our modern tools and our modern understanding. And this evidence sits in museums and archaeological sites around the world, quietly challenging anyone who takes the time to actually measure it, to actually analyze it with the dispassionate tools of engineering, rather than the predetermined conclusions of historical orthodoxy. Consider Göbekli Tepe, a name that means potbelly hill in Turkish, an unassuming rise in the landscape of southeastern Turkey that hid beneath its soil the oldest known megalithic site on Earth. A complex of massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circular enclosures, some weighing as much as 20 tons, carved with sophisticated reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. And, when archaeologists finally excavated this site and subjected the organic material found there to radiocarbon dating, the results came back with dates that should have been impossible. 11,500 years old, placing the construction of Göbekli Tepe firmly in the pre-pottery Neolithic period, a time when humans had supposedly just figured out that you could plant seeds instead of simply gathering whatever grew wild. A time that predates the invention of pottery, the invention of metallurgy, the invention of writing, the invention of everything we associate with the word civilization. And yet, here stood these massive pillars, precisely carved and deliberately arranged, requiring not just brute labor, but sophisticated planning, organizational capabilities that could mobilize and feed hundreds of workers, and engineering knowledge that could quarry, transport, erect, and carve multi-ton stones with a level of precision that suggests these people possessed knowledge and capabilities that have been completely absent from our historical narrative. The implications of Göbekli Tepe ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. Because if people 11,500 years ago could accomplish this feat of engineering and organization, what else could they do? And, more troublingly, what other evidence of their capabilities has been dismissed or ignored because it doesn't fit the timeline we've constructed? Because it arrives in the archaeological record thousands of years too early. Like finding a working smartphone in a medieval monastery, or discovering a jet engine in ancient Rome. The archaeological record is filled with these temporal anomalies, these artifacts and sites that appear in the wrong place at the wrong time. And rather than forcing us to reconsider our timeline, rather than making us question whether our neat progression from primitive to advanced might be a fiction we've imposed on a far more complex reality, the academic establishment has developed elaborate explanations for why these impossible things aren't actually impossible. Explanations that often require more faith than the alternative hypothesis that perhaps, just perhaps, we've gotten the timeline fundamentally wrong. In a small museum in Baghdad, before the chaos of war scattered collections and destroyed records, there sat a collection of clay jars that had been discovered in 1936 in the ruins of a Parthian village dating to around 200 BCE. And these jars, which measured about 5 inches tall, contained copper cylinders held in place with asphalt. And inside these copper cylinders were iron rods. And when researchers in the 1970s decided to actually test these objects, rather than simply cataloguing them and filing them away, They filled the jars with an acidic liquid, like vinegar or wine, and discovered that the assemblages produced an electrical current of approximately 1 to 2 volts, making them functional batteries. Electrochemical cells that could have been used for electroplating or possibly for some form of electrical stimulation therapy. And the implications of this discovery of finding battery technology 2,000 years before Alessandro Volta supposedly invented the battery in 1800 should have revolutionized our understanding of ancient technological capability. But instead, these artifacts, known as the Baghdad batteries, have been relegated to the status of curiosities, interesting anomalies that most historians prefer to explain away rather than integrate into the broader narrative of human technological development. Imagine, for a moment, that you are an archaeologist 3,000 years in the future, excavating the ruins of our current civilization, and you discover a laptop computer buried in the rubble of what was once New York City. And, according to all your historical records, according to every text and every expert in your field, computers weren't invented until 500 years after the date you've assigned to this particular archaeological layer. And you're faced with a choice. Either revise your entire timeline, admit that your understanding of when technology developed is fundamentally flawed, or come up with an explanation for why this laptop isn't really what it appears to be, perhaps arguing that it was just a decorative object, that the people who made it didn't actually understand its function, that it must have been used for some other purpose entirely, perhaps as a religious artifact or a status symbol for the elite. Anything but what it obviously is, a piece of sophisticated technology that shouldn't exist in this time period, according to your accepted chronology. This is precisely the position that modern archaeologists and historians find themselves in when confronted with artifacts like the Baghdad batteries, with precision-machined stone objects from pre-dynastic Egypt, with astronomical knowledge encoded in monuments that predate the supposed invention of writing. And the cognitive dissonance this creates is so profound that it becomes easier, psychologically easier, professionally easier, to dismiss the evidence than to accept its implications. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered by sponge divers in a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901, sat in a museum for decades before anyone really understood what it was, appearing to be nothing more than a corroded lump of bronze and wood. But when researchers finally subjected it to X-ray analysis and careful study, they discovered that this lump was actually an intricate geared device, an astronomical calculator of astonishing complexity, containing at least 30 bronze gears with precisely cut teeth, capable of predicting the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, capable of predicting eclipses years in advance, capable of tracking the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic Games. And this device, dated to approximately 100 BCE, represents a level of mechanical sophistication that wouldn't be seen again in European technology until the 14th century, creating a gap of nearly 1,500 years where this knowledge apparently vanished completely from human civilization, as if someone had taken an encyclopedia of mechanical engineering and thrown it into the sea, leaving humanity to reinvent everything from scratch. The existence of the Antikythera mechanism raises questions that historians have struggled to answer satisfactorily. Because if ancient Greeks in 100 BCE could create such sophisticated machinery, what else were they capable of? And, more importantly, where did they learn to create such devices? because the Antikythera mechanism isn't a first attempt, isn't a crude prototype full of mistakes and inefficiencies, but rather appears to be a refined example of a mature technology, suggesting that there were earlier versions, simpler versions, a whole developmental history of geared astronomical calculators that we have no evidence for. No archaeological trail leading to this moment of apparent technological perfection. It's as if the device appeared fully formed, materializing in history without ancestors. And this pattern, this appearance of sophisticated technology without apparent developmental history, repeats itself throughout the archaeological record, particularly as we push back further and further in time, past the Sumerians, past the first cities and the first writing, into the period that we have labeled prehistoric, because we assume that nothing of historical significance happened there. But the evidence, the actual physical evidence, tells us otherwise. We are asked to believe that human beings, anatomically identical to us, with brains just as large and just as capable, with hands just as dexterous and eyes just as keen, spent hundreds of thousands of years doing essentially nothing, making the same simple stone tools generation after generation, living in small bands of hunter-gatherers, and then suddenly, as if someone flipped a switch, discovered agriculture and writing and mathematics and engineering, all within a few thousand years, experiencing an explosion of capability that took us from mud huts to the pyramids, in what amounts to the blink of an eye in evolutionary terms. And this narrative requires us to believe that our ancestors were fundamentally different from us, less capable, less curious, less intelligent, for hundreds of thousands of years, before mysteriously becoming just like us, right around the time the Sumerians started writing on clay tablets. The alternative explanation, the one that the physical evidence seems to support, but that requires us to abandon our comfortable timeline and our comfortable assumptions about the linear progress of civilization, is that humans have been capable of sophisticated technology for far longer than we've acknowledged, that civilizations have risen and fallen in the deep past, that knowledge has been gained and lost, and partially recovered, and that what we see in Sumer is not the beginning of civilization, but rather a beginning, one chapter in a much longer and more complex story that we've only started to uncover, because we've only recently begun to question the timeline that has been handed down to us as unquestionable truth. The stones don't care about our theories. The artifacts don't care about our academic consensus. They simply exist, waiting to be measured and analyzed by anyone willing to look past the explanatory frameworks we've constructed to protect our understanding of history from uncomfortable revisions. And in the next chapter, we will descend into the deepest mystery of all, the stone objects carved with such precision that modern engineers cannot explain how they were made, cannot replicate them with our advanced tools, and can only stand before them in the same bewildered silence that Dr. Christopher Dunn experienced in that Cairo museum basement, wondering what other impossible things our ancestors accomplished, and what other lies we've been telling ourselves about who we are and where we came from. The workshop of master stonemason Roger Hopkins fell silent on an autumn afternoon in 1991 when he set down his tools and admitted something that no craftsman enjoys admitting, which is that a task he had been attempting to complete for weeks, a simple replication of an ancient Egyptian stone vase using modern equipment and techniques that should have made the job relatively straightforward, was proving to be utterly impossible. Not because he lacked skill or experience. Hopkins had spent decades working with stone, had carved everything from delicate architectural details to massive structural elements. But because the original artifact he was attempting to copy, a pre-dynastic Egyptian vase carved from solid diorite and dating to approximately 3000 BCE, displayed characteristics that shouldn't exist in a world where ancient peoples worked with copper chisels and pounding stones. Characteristics like perfectly symmetrical curves that varied by less than a millimeter across the entire surface, wall thickness of just 2 millimeters maintained uniformly throughout the vessel, and interior hollowing that would require specialized tools capable of reaching into tight spaces and removing material with surgical precision. All accomplished in a stone that ranks 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, harder than steel, harder than the copper tools that ancient Egyptians supposedly used to carve it. This moment of honest admission, captured on film for a documentary that would later air on PBS, represents something far more significant than one craftsman's struggle with a difficult project, because it forces us to confront a fundamental problem that archaeologists and historians have worked very hard to avoid confronting, which is that the stone objects surviving from humanity's distant past, particularly those objects created before the rise of civilizations we can comfortably explain, display manufacturing characteristics that our best modern craftsmen cannot reproduce without computer-controlled machinery. And this impossibility creates a fracture in our historical narrative that no amount of creative explanation can fully repair, leaving us with only 2 options. Either accept that ancient peoples possessed technologies and techniques that have been completely lost to history, technologies that we cannot even imagine because they left no trace beyond their products. Or accept that our timeline is wrong, that these objects are not as old as we think they are, that the dating methods we rely on have somehow failed us. But both options require abandoning positions that academic institutions have staked their reputations on defending, making the truth, whatever it might be, professionally dangerous to pursue. The stone vases of pre-dynastic Egypt number in the tens of thousands, scattered across museum collections and private holdings throughout the world. And while many of these vessels are simple bowls or utilitarian containers, a significant number display manufacturing precision that defies explanation, with walls so thin that light passes through them, with surfaces polished to a mirror finish without any visible tool marks, with symmetry so perfect that when engineers measure them with modern coordinate measuring machines, the same instruments used to verify precision in aerospace manufacturing, they find variations measured in microns, in thousandths of a millimeter. Tolerances that modern stoneworkers achieve only with diamond-tipped tools spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute, guided by computer programs that adjust position and pressure hundreds of times per second. And yet, we are asked to believe that ancient Egyptians, working in the centuries before they had writing, before they had the wheel, before they had mathematics as we understand it, created these objects by hand, patiently grinding away at some of the hardest stones on Earth, with tools made of softer materials, somehow maintaining perfect symmetry and uniform wall thickness through nothing more than exceptional skill and unlimited patience. The engineering analysis of these vases becomes even more problematic when we consider not just the exterior surfaces, but the interior hollowing. because many of these vessels have narrow necks that open into wide bodies, meaning that whoever carved them had to reach through a small opening and remove material from areas they could not see, could not easily access with their hands or tools, all while maintaining uniform wall thickness and symmetrical curves. A task that would be challenging even with modern, flexible rotary tools and fiber optic cameras. Yet, somehow, ancient craftsmen accomplished this feat using methods that have left no archaeological trace, no tool marks that would indicate their technique, no failed attempts or practice pieces that would show the learning curve necessary to develop such extraordinary skill. As if these objects appeared fully formed in history, without the developmental stage that every technology requires, materializing in the archaeological record already perfect, already impossible. 2,300 miles to the west of Egypt, high in the Bolivian Altiplano, at an elevation of nearly 13,000 feet, where the air is thin and the sun burns with unfiltered intensity, lie the ruins of Puma Punku, a temple complex that forms part of the larger Tiwanaku site. And here, among the scattered blocks of red sandstone and grey andesite, we find stoneworking that makes the Egyptian vases look almost primitive by comparison. Because the builders of Puma Punku, working sometime between 536 and 600 CE, according to radiocarbon dating, though some researchers argue for dates as early as 14,000 BCE, based on astronomical alignments and geological evidence, created blocks of stone with perfectly flat surfaces, extending across areas of several square feet. Surfaces so flat that when engineers place precision straightedges across them, they find deviations of less than 1/100th of an inch. And these surfaces meet at corners that form perfect 90-degree angles. And these blocks contain complex interlocking features, including notches, grooves, and tenons that fit together with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, all carved in andesite and diorite, igneous rocks that rank among the hardest materials that ancient peoples could have worked with, stones that would have destroyed bronze tools almost immediately and would have been only marginally affected by the hardest stone pounders. The precision of Puma Punku extends beyond simple flat surfaces into the realm of what engineers call complex geometry, because among the scattered blocks lie H-shaped stones with grooves running along their length, stones with precise channels cut at right angles to each other, stones with raised bosses positioned with mathematical exactitude. And when modern researchers have attempted to reverse engineer the manufacturing process that could have created these features, they find themselves reaching for explanations that involve diamond-tipped saws, precision grinding equipment, and possibly even computer-guided machinery. Because the alternatives, the traditional archaeological explanations involving copper chisels and patient pounding with harder stones, simply cannot account for the level of precision observed in the finished products, cannot explain how ancient peoples achieved surface flatness that modern stonemasons struggle to replicate, cannot explain the perfect right angles and the complex interlocking features that would require not just skill, but a sophisticated understanding of three-dimensional geometry, and probably some form of template or pattern system that left no archaeological trace. The mystery deepens when we examine the core samples taken from ancient Egyptian stonework, particularly the holes drilled into granite in the Valley of the Kings, and in various temples throughout Egypt, because these cores show spiral grooves running along their length, grooves that indicate the drill bit was cutting through solid granite at a rate of approximately 1/10 of an inch per revolution. And when modern engineers calculate the forces necessary to achieve such cutting rates in granite, using the copper tube drills that archaeologists insist ancient Egyptians must have used, they arrive at figures that are simply impossible, requiring pressures of several tons applied to drill bits that would have been too fragile to withstand such forces, requiring rotational speeds that human or animal power could not have sustained, and, most problematically, requiring the copper tubes to somehow be harder than the granite they were cutting, which violates basic materials science, unless we accept that ancient Egyptians had access to abrasives or cutting compounds that were far more effective than the quartz sand that traditional explanations rely on. Compounds that have left no trace in the archaeological record and that metallurgists cannot identify or explain. These core samples, sitting in museums where anyone can examine them, represent physical evidence that contradicts the official narrative of how ancient stonework was accomplished. And yet, this contradiction is rarely acknowledged in mainstream archaeology, rarely taught in universities where students learn about ancient Egypt, rarely mentioned in the documentaries that confidently explain how massive pyramids and elaborate temples were built using nothing but copper tools, wooden sledges, and vast armies of laborers. Because acknowledging the implications of these drill cores would require admitting that we don't actually know how ancient Egyptians accomplished their most impressive feats of stoneworking, would require opening the door to alternative explanations that might include lost technologies or knowledge systems that don't fit comfortably within our understanding of technological progress, as a linear journey from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced. In China's Zhejiang province, carved directly into solid sandstone hills, lie the Longyu Caves, a series of massive underground chambers that were accidentally discovered in 1992, when local villagers decided to pump water out of what they thought were small ponds, but turned out to be flooded caves of staggering size and precision, with the largest chamber covering more than 3,000 square meters and extending 30 meters underground, supported by precisely carved pillars that rise from floor to ceiling. And every surface in these chambers, every wall and ceiling and pillar, is covered with parallel chisel marks that are uniform in depth and spacing, creating a decorative pattern that extends across thousands of square meters. And the engineering precision of these spaces is remarkable, not just for the uniformity of the tool marks, but for the flatness of the floors and ceilings, for the perfect verticality of the walls, for the fact that no structural supports beyond the carved pillars were necessary, suggesting that whoever excavated these chambers understood the load-bearing properties of the surrounding rock and designed the spaces to distribute weight efficiently, all while removing an estimated 1 million cubic meters of stone that left no archaeological trace, no debris piles, no evidence of where this massive quantity of material was taken, or how it was transported from the chambers. The Longyu Caves present archaeologists with multiple interconnected mysteries that resist simple explanation, because radiocarbon dating of organic material found in the chambers suggests they are at least 2,000 years old, placing their construction in a period when Chinese civilization was certainly advanced, but not, according to conventional understanding, capable of undertaking underground construction projects of this scale and precision, and the complete absence of any historical records mentioning these caves, despite their massive size and the enormous labor investment they represent. suggests either that our records of ancient Chinese history are far more incomplete than we realize, or that the caves are significantly older than the radiocarbon dates indicate, old enough to predate the historical periods that Chinese written records cover, which would push their construction back into the realm of prehistory, where, according to everything we've been taught, humans lacked the organizational capabilities and technical knowledge to accomplish such feats. The acoustic properties of ancient stone chambers add another layer of mystery to the engineering capabilities of prehistoric peoples. Because when researchers measure the sound characteristics of sites like Newgrange in Ireland, a passage tomb built approximately 3200 BCE, they discover that the chamber is tuned to resonate at a specific frequency around 110 Hz. And this frequency, when vocalized or played on instruments, creates standing waves inside the chamber that would have produced unusual auditory and possibly physiological effects on people inside. And the precision required to achieve such acoustic properties is remarkable, requiring careful attention to chamber dimensions, ceiling shape, and wall angles, suggesting that the builders either understood the mathematics of sound propagation and resonance or conducted extensive trial and error experiments until they achieved the desired effect. But either explanation requires acknowledging a level of sophistication that doesn't fit the narrative of Neolithic farmers who built these structures as simple burial chambers, forcing us to consider whether there might have been purposes beyond burial, purposes related to ritual or altered states of consciousness, or some application of acoustic knowledge that we can barely begin to understand from our modern perspective. The pattern that emerges from examining these stone mysteries, from the precision vases of Egypt to the impossible blocks of Pumapunku, from the drill cores that shouldn't exist to the underground chambers carved with unexplainable precision, from the acoustic engineering of Neolithic tombs to the countless other examples of ancient stonework that defy simple explanation, is a pattern of capabilities appearing in the archaeological record without apparent developmental history, without the progression from crude to refined that characterizes every other human technology. And this pattern forces us to confront the possibility that our understanding of when and how human technological capability developed is fundamentally flawed. That the neat timeline we've constructed, with Sumer at the starting line and everything before as primitive prehistory, might be a fiction we've imposed on evidence that tells a far stranger and more complex story. A story that the next chapter will explore, as we examine maps that show coastlines that shouldn't be visible, lands that were supposedly unknown, surveyed with techniques that supposedly didn't exist, by civilizations that supposedly never were. Captain Arlington H. Mallory sat in his office at the United States Navy Hydrographic Bureau in 1956, examining a photographic copy of a map that had been drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. And as Mallory traced the coastlines with his finger, decades of experience in cartography and naval navigation told him something that should have been impossible, which was that the southern portion of this map, the section that showed what appeared to be the northern coast of Antarctica, had been drawn using source materials that predated the European discovery of Antarctica by more than 300 years. And, more troublingly, the coastline depicted on the map appeared to show not the ice-covered continent that existed in 1513, or exists today, but rather the subglacial coastline, the actual rocky shore that lies beneath 2 miles of ice. a coastline that modern science only mapped in 1949 using sophisticated sonar equipment during the Norwegian, British, Swedish Antarctic expedition. Meaning that whoever drew the source maps that Piri Reis copied must have surveyed Antarctica when it was at least partially ice-free, which geological evidence suggests would place the survey at least 13,000 years ago, in a period that every history textbook describes as the late Paleolithic, when humans were supposed to be hunting mammoths and gathering berries, not sailing the southern oceans and conducting systematic geographic surveys of the Antarctic continent. The implications of Mallory's analysis, which was later confirmed by other cartographers and Navy officials in a formal evaluation that was, unfortunately, never widely publicized, create a temporal paradox that academic historians have never satisfactorily resolved. Because accepting the accuracy of the Piri Reis map requires accepting that a maritime civilization with advanced navigational capabilities existed during or before the last ice age. A civilization that not only possessed ships capable of sailing Antarctic waters, but also had developed sophisticated surveying techniques and maintained some system for recording and preserving geographic information across thousands of years. And this civilization, if it existed, left no other trace in the archaeological record, according to conventional archaeology. No cities, no written records, no artifacts that would clearly identify it as the advanced seafaring culture that the map evidence suggests must have existed. Which forces us into an uncomfortable position, where we must either dismiss the map evidence as coincidence or misinterpretation, or we must accept that our understanding of prehistoric human capability is so fundamentally incomplete that we've missed an entire chapter of human civilization. Perhaps the most important chapter, the one that explains where so much apparently impossible knowledge came from when it appears suddenly in the historical record. Piri Reis himself provides clues about the origins of his map in the marginal notes he inscribed on the surviving fragment, explaining that he compiled it from approximately 20 source maps, some dating to the time of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE, and that among his sources were maps captured from Spanish sailors who had sailed with Christopher Columbus. But Columbus himself made references in his journals to using ancient maps that showed lands across the Atlantic Ocean. Maps whose origins were already mysterious in the 15th century, suggesting a chain of copying and recopying that extends back through Islamic cartographers, through Byzantine scholars, through the Library of Alexandria, back into the mists of antiquity, where the original surveys must have been conducted. And each generation of copying would have introduced errors and distortions. Yet the fundamental accuracy of the Antarctic coastline on the Piri Reis map remained intact through all these centuries, suggesting either that the original maps were remarkably accurate, or that multiple independent source maps were consulted and compared, allowing cartographers to correct errors and maintain geographic truth across millennia. The Piri Reis map is not alone in depicting geographic knowledge that shouldn't exist in the historical periods when these maps were drawn. Because, in 1531, a French cartographer named Oronteus Phineas produced a world map that shows the Antarctic continent in stunning detail, centered correctly on the South Pole, with mountain ranges and rivers marked across its surface. And when modern researchers compare the Oronteus Phineas map to current geographic knowledge of what lies beneath Antarctica's ice sheet, they find remarkable correlations, with mountain ranges appearing in the correct locations, with coastlines matching the subglacial continental shelf, with the continent's overall shape and proportions accurate to a degree that seems impossible for a mapmaker working in 1531, decades before Antarctica was officially discovered, and centuries before anyone had any idea what lay beneath its frozen surface. And Phineas, like Piri Reis, makes no claim to have discovered this information himself, but rather presents his map as a compilation of ancient sources, suggesting that in the 16th century there still existed in European map collections fragments of geographic knowledge dating back to some earlier age of exploration. The mathematical sophistication required to create these maps presents its own set of impossible problems for the conventional historical timeline. Because accurately mapping the spherical surface of Earth onto a flat piece of paper or parchment requires understanding that Earth is spherical rather than flat, and it requires mastering one of several possible map projection systems, mathematical transformations that preserve certain properties of the spherical surface while necessarily distorting others. And the Piri Reis map appears to use a form of projection that resembles what modern cartographers call an azimuthal equidistant projection centered on Cairo, a projection that requires sophisticated trigonometric calculations and a precise understanding of Earth's dimensions. And while the Islamic scholars of the medieval period certainly had access to Greek mathematical texts and had preserved and expanded upon ancient geographic knowledge, the ultimate source of this knowledge, the civilization that first developed these mathematical techniques and first applied them to creating accurate world maps, remains frustratingly invisible in the archaeological and historical record. When we examine the Piri Reis map more closely, focusing on its depiction of South America, we find geographic features that European explorers had not yet discovered in 1513, including accurate renderings of the Andes Mountains, shown in their correct locations along the western coast, and the mouth of the Amazon River depicted with remarkable accuracy, and the coastline of South America south of the equator, drawn with a precision that wouldn't be achieved by European cartographers for another century, suggesting that the source maps Piri Reis worked from contained information gathered by someone who had conducted systematic surveys of the South American continent, someone who had sailed along its coasts and possibly ventured into its interior. And this someone could not have been the Spanish and Portuguese explorers who were just beginning their tentative explorations of the New World in the early 16th century, meaning that the source maps must have been based on information gathered in an earlier era, perhaps during the period when Antarctica was still partially ice-free, when a maritime civilization that history has forgotten was apparently conducting geographic surveys across the entire globe. Buache map of 1737, created by French cartographer Philippe Buache, presents perhaps the most startling evidence of ancient geographic knowledge, because this map shows Antarctica not as a single landmass, but as two separate islands, a depiction that turns out to be absolutely correct, according to modern seismic surveys that have mapped the bedrock beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, revealing that what appears to be a single continent is actually two large islands connected by a land bridge that rises above sea level only because of the immense weight of ice pressing down on the underlying rock. And without this ice, without the depression caused by its weight, Antarctica would indeed appear as two separate landmasses, exactly as Buache depicted it in 1737. And when asked where he obtained this information, Buache claimed to be working from ancient source maps, maps whose origins he could not fully trace, but which he believed contained geographic knowledge dating back to classical antiquity or even earlier. And modern geologists confirm that Antarctica would have appeared as two islands during the periods when it was less glaciated, particularly during the warming periods between ice ages, suggesting that whoever surveyed Antarctica and created these original source maps did so during a time when the continent was at least partially ice-free, and when the true subglacial geography would have been visible. The existence of these Renaissance maps showing impossible geographic knowledge creates a bibliographic mystery that researchers have struggled to solve, because we know that major map collections existed in antiquity, particularly the famous Library of Alexandria, which supposedly housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls and texts, including geographic treatises and maps compiled from sources throughout the ancient Mediterranean world and beyond. And when this library was destroyed in a series of fires and raids between the 1st and 7th centuries CE, incalculable amount of ancient knowledge was lost, including potentially these ancient maps that showed the true extent of human geographic knowledge in prehistoric times. But fragments survived, copies and partial copies that were preserved in Byzantine libraries, in Islamic centers of learning, in monastery archives throughout Europe. And it was from these fragments that Renaissance cartographers like Piri Reis and Orontius Phineas and Philippe Buache compiled their impossible maps. Maps that preserved echoes of a lost age of exploration, but which modern historians have largely ignored or dismissed, because accepting their implications would require completely revising our understanding of human capability in prehistoric times. The technical requirements for conducting the kind of systematic global survey that these maps suggest must have occurred are staggering when we consider the supposed technological limitations of prehistoric peoples. Because accurate map-making requires not just sailing to distant lands, but also requires instruments for measuring latitude and preferably longitude, requires some system for recording and preserving observations, requires mathematical knowledge sufficient to perform the calculations necessary for creating map projections, requires organizational capabilities that could coordinate survey expeditions and compile their findings into comprehensive world maps. And every one of these requirements points toward a level of civilization and technical sophistication that should not exist in human history before the rise of classical Greek civilization at the earliest. And yet, the maps themselves, the physical evidence that survives in the form of these Renaissance compilations of ancient sources, insist that such a civilization did exist, that it conducted systematic surveys of Earth's geography during a period when Antarctica was less glaciated than it is today, and that it possessed mathematical and navigational knowledge that was sophisticated enough to create accurate maps using advanced projection systems. The accuracy of these ancient source maps becomes even more remarkable when we consider the specific features they depict correctly. Because the Piri Reis map shows the Falkland Islands in their correct position off the coast of Argentina. Islands that were officially discovered by European explorers in 1592, nearly 80 years after Piri Reis drew his map. And it shows details of the Caribbean islands and the coast of Central America with an accuracy that suggests systematic survey rather than rough estimation. And when we examine these details with modern cartographic tools, measuring distances and angles and comparing them to accurate modern maps, we find that whoever created the original source maps possessed instruments and techniques for determining position that were at least comparable to what European navigators achieved in the 16th century with their astrolabes and cross-staffs. And possibly more sophisticated, because some of the longitude measurements implied by the map's accuracy suggest knowledge of techniques for determining longitude that European science wouldn't develop until the 18th century, when accurate maritime chronometers finally made it possible to calculate longitude by comparing local solar time to a known reference time. The conventional explanations offered by academic historians for these impossible maps generally fall into two categories, neither of which withstands serious scrutiny when we examine the actual evidence. The first explanation suggests that the maps are simply lucky guesses, that Renaissance cartographers drew Antarctica based on theoretical assumptions about continental symmetry, and happened by pure coincidence to get the shape and position approximately correct. But this explanation fails to account for the specific, accurate details, like the correct depiction of the subglacial coastline, the mountains and rivers actually exist beneath the ice, the separation of Antarctica into two land masses, details that could not possibly be lucky guesses, because they require specific knowledge of geographic features that were not visible in the 16th century and would not be discovered for another 400 years. The second explanation suggests that the maps are simply inaccurate, that modern researchers who see Antarctica in these Renaissance maps are engaging in wishful thinking or seeing patterns that don't really exist. But this explanation requires us to ignore the detailed cartographic analyses performed by professional cartographers and Navy officials, people whose careers depended on their ability to accurately interpret maps, and who confirmed that the geographic correlations were too specific and too numerous to be dismissed as coincidence or misinterpretation. The maps force us to confront a question that cuts to the heart of how we understand human history and human capability. If A, maritime civilization advanced enough to survey the entire world and create accurate maps, existed more than 13,000 years ago, where are the other traces of this civilization? Where are the cities, and the ships, and the instruments, and the written records? And why has archaeology failed to find clear evidence of such an advanced culture in the prehistoric period? This question leads us into the next chapter, where we will explore how these same prehistoric peoples apparently possessed astronomical knowledge that required centuries of continuous observation and sophisticated mathematical understanding. Knowledge that appears in monuments and alignments throughout the world. Knowledge that speaks of a civilization that watched the stars with the patience and precision of modern scientists, recording cycles that take thousands of years to complete, preserving information that could only have been gathered across multiple generations of dedicated observation, and raising the disturbing possibility that what we call the beginning of human civilization was actually a rebuilding, a desperate attempt by survivors of some prehistoric catastrophe to preserve and transmit the knowledge of a world that had been lost. Dr. Robert Bauval stood in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid in 1983, having travelled from his home in Kuwait to pursue a question that had haunted him since childhood. And as he examined the narrow shafts extending from the chamber at precise angles through hundreds of feet of solid limestone, angles that Egyptologists had long explained as simple ventilation ducts, despite the fact that they were sealed at both ends and therefore could not possibly ventilate anything, He began calculating the astronomical alignments these shafts pointed toward. And the results of his calculations revealed something that should have been impossible for pyramid builders working in 2500 BCE, which was that the southern shaft from the king's chamber aligned perfectly with Orion's belt as it appeared at its lowest point in its precessional cycle, and the southern shaft from the queen's chamber aligned with Sirius. And these alignments were not approximate or coincidental, but mathematically precise, requiring knowledge of a phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes, a slow wobble in Earth's axis that takes 25,920 years to complete one full cycle. A phenomenon that causes the position of stars relative to the horizon to shift gradually over centuries and millennia. And this phenomenon was supposedly not discovered until the Greek astronomer Hipparchus documented it around 150 BCE, more than 2,000 years after the Great Pyramid was built, leaving us with the uncomfortable realization that either the ancient Egyptians understood precession long before the Greeks, or the pyramid is far older than we think, or someone from an even earlier period provided the astronomical knowledge necessary to encode these alignments into the bit structure. The precession of the equinoxes is not something that can be discovered through casual observation of the night sky, because the shift in stellar positions occurs so slowly that multiple human lifetimes would need to pass before the change became noticeable. And even then, detecting the pattern would require systematic record-keeping across centuries, comparing the position of stars at key moments, like the spring equinox or the winter solstice, over many generations, maintaining precise observational data in some form that could survive long enough for patterns to emerge, and the calculations necessary to understand that this shift follows a predictable cycle, that it completes a full rotation every 25,920 years, require sophisticated mathematical knowledge and a conceptual framework that understands astronomical phenomena as following natural laws, rather than being the unpredictable whims of gods. And yet this knowledge, this understanding that should represent the culmination of centuries of careful observation and mathematical analysis, appears encoded in structures built thousands of years before anyone was supposedly keeping the kinds of records necessary to discover it, suggesting either that our dating of these structures is wrong, or that the builders had access to astronomical knowledge accumulated over time periods much longer than conventional history allows. Stonehenge, that iconic circle of massive sarsen stones standing on Salisbury Plain in southern England, has long been recognized as having astronomical significance, with its primary axis aligned to the summer solstice sunrise. But this simple alignment, impressive as it may be for a structure built around 2500 BCE using nothing but stone tools and human labor, represents only the most obvious of the astronomical functions encoded in the monument's design. Because when researchers conduct detailed surveys of the stone positions and analyze the sightlines created by various combinations of stones and the positions where observers would need to stand to utilize these sightlines, they discover that Stonehenge functions as a sophisticated calculator for predicting lunar cycles, including the 18.6-year cycle in which the moon's maximum declination shifts from its northern extreme to its southern extreme and back again. And even more remarkably, Stonehenge can predict eclipses years in advance, using the 56 Aubrey holes that form a circle around the stones as markers in a counting system that tracks the relationship between solar and lunar cycles. and the level of astronomical understanding required to design such a system, to recognize the mathematical relationships between different celestial cycles, and to encode them in physical structures that could serve as permanent calculating devices, suggests a sophistication in Neolithic astronomy that conventional archaeology has been reluctant to fully acknowledge. The builders of Stonehenge did not simply point one axis toward the rising sun and call it a temple. Instead, they created a three-dimensional astronomical instrument that required understanding multiple interrelated celestial cycles, understanding the mathematics that govern the relationships between these cycles, and possessing the engineering capability to translate this understanding into a physical structure where the position of every stone serves a calculational purpose. And the fact that this monument was constructed over several phases spanning more than 1,000 years, with each phase adding new astronomical functions and refining the precision of existing alignments, suggests a continuous tradition of astronomical observation and knowledge transmission that extended across dozens of generations, requiring not just individual genius, but institutional memory. Some system for passing sophisticated astronomical knowledge from one generation of builders and observers to the next. And this institutional continuity in Neolithic Britain, this ability to maintain and expand upon astronomical knowledge across centuries, implies a level of social organization and cultural sophistication that fits uncomfortably with our image of Stone Age peoples as primitive farmers struggling for survival in a harsh and unforgiving landscape. In the Nubian desert of southern Egypt, approximately 600 miles from the pyramids of Giza, lies a site called Nabta Playa, where archaeologists have discovered a stone circle that carbon dating places at approximately 7,000 years old, making it at least 2,000 years older than Stonehenge and nearly 5,000 years older than any known megalithic site in Europe. And this stone circle, though smaller and less visually impressive than Stonehenge, encodes astronomical knowledge that is arguably even more sophisticated and certainly more mysterious. Because the alignments at Nabta Playa point not to celestial objects as they appeared when the circle was built, but rather to the positions of stars as they appeared thousands of years earlier, specifically to the position of Orion's belt as it appeared at its lowest point in its precessional cycle around 16,500 BCE, more than 9,000 years before the stone circle was constructed, raising the profound question of why Neolithic peoples in the Sahara, who supposedly had only recently transitioned from hunting and gathering to pastoralism, would encode ancient astronomical data into their monuments, data that referred to stellar positions from a period that predated their own culture by thousands of years, unless they were attempting to preserve knowledge inherited from an earlier civilization, knowledge that they recognized as important, even if they no longer fully understood its original context or purpose. The Nabta Playa stone circle forces us to confront the possibility that astronomical knowledge in the prehistoric period was not being discovered fresh by each culture, but was rather being inherited and preserved from earlier sources. That the sophisticated understanding of precession and celestial cycles that we find encoded in monuments from Egypt to England to the Americas might not represent independent discovery, but rather fragments of a much older knowledge system that different cultures were attempting to preserve in the only permanent medium available to them, which was stone monuments aligned to celestial positions. Monuments that could survive for millennia and communicate astronomical knowledge even to people who no longer possessed the mathematical sophistication to fully decode it. And this possibility transforms our understanding of megalithic monuments, from simple ritual sites or primitive calendars into something far more significant. Libraries of astronomical data encoded in stone. Repositories of knowledge inherited from a civilization that understood the heavens with a precision that would not be matched again until the development of modern astronomy. At Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, that impossibly ancient megalithic site that we encountered in the first chapter, researchers have identified what may be the most explicit representation of astronomical knowledge encoded in prehistoric stone. Because Pillar 43, also known as the Vulture Stone, displays a series of carved symbols that researcher Martin Sweatman and his colleagues at the University of Edinburgh have interpreted as a star map, depicting the sky as it appeared around 10,950 BCE, and, more specifically, depicting a catastrophic comet impact that occurred at that time, an event that would have been visible as a dramatic brightening in the sky, followed by a period of darkness and climate disruption. And the symbols on the pillar, when analyzed as astronomical representations using computer simulations of the ancient sky, align with specific constellations, including Scorpius and Sagittarius, with the positions of the Milky Way, and with what appears to be a representation of a comet or meteor shower. And if this interpretation is correct, if the people who carved Pillar 43 were indeed recording a cosmic catastrophe that occurred more than 13,000 years ago, then they possessed not only sophisticated astronomical knowledge, but also a system for symbolically representing celestial phenomena, and a compelling reason to preserve the memory of this event in permanent stone. The encoding of astronomical knowledge in monuments that are themselves thousands of years old, but which point to stellar positions from even more ancient times, creates a temporal puzzle that conventional archaeology has struggled to explain. Because it suggests either that astronomical observations were being conducted and recorded for extremely long periods, potentially spanning tens of thousands of years, or that knowledge of ancient astronomical configurations was being preserved and transmitted across many generations. And either explanation requires accepting that prehistoric peoples possessed capabilities that our standard models of human development do not account for. Capabilities that include not just the ability to make precise astronomical observations, but also the institutional stability and cultural continuity necessary to maintain observational programs across hundreds or thousands of years, and the symbolic or mathematical systems necessary to record and transmit this information, and the engineering knowledge required to encode it in massive stone monuments that could preserve it for future generations. When the Sumerians appear in the historical record around 3500 BCE, already possessing a fully developed writing system and sophisticated urban civilization, they bring with them astronomical knowledge that is remarkably complete and accurate, including detailed information about all the visible planets in the solar system, accurate values for the synodic periods of these planets, the time it takes for them to return to the same position relative to the Sun as seen from Earth, and a sophisticated mathematical system based on the number 60 that was particularly well suited for astronomical calculations, because 60 has many divisors, making it easier to work with fractions and perform the kinds of calculations that astronomy requires. And the question that this sudden appearance of sophisticated astronomical knowledge raises is the same question raised by the precision stonework and the impossible maps. Where did it come from? Because the kind of astronomical knowledge the Sumerians possessed requires centuries of systematic observation, requires multiple generations of astronomers comparing observations and refining calculations, requires institutional support that could maintain observational programs over long periods. And yet, when the Sumerians appear in history, they already have this knowledge, as if they inherited it fully formed from some earlier source. The Sumerian astronomical texts, preserved in cuneiform tablets that survived because they were baked clay rather than perishable materials like papyrus or parchment, reveal knowledge that seems too sophisticated for a civilization that was, supposedly, just emerging from prehistory, including awareness that the planets move in regular patterns that can be predicted, understanding that eclipses follow calculable cycles, and recognition that the celestial sphere rotates around Earth, or, from our modern perspective, that Earth rotates, with mathematical precision. And while the Sumerians themselves attributed this astronomical knowledge to gifts from the gods, specifically from a group of deities they called the Anunnaki, who supposedly came from the heavens and taught humanity the arts of civilization, we might interpret this mythology as a cultural memory of knowledge inheritance, of astronomical wisdom that came to the Sumerians not from divine intervention, but from human predecessors, from an earlier civilization that had accumulated this knowledge through long observation and that transmitted it forward through whatever means survived a catastrophic disruption to their civilization. The mathematical sophistication required to understand and predict astronomical phenomena goes far beyond simple observation, because while anyone can notice that the sun rises and sets and that the seasons cycle through the year, recognizing the more subtle patterns in celestial motion requires detailed record-keeping and mathematical analysis. And understanding precession requires not just detecting the slow shift in stellar positions, but recognizing that this shift follows a predictable pattern, calculating the rate of this shift, and extrapolating forward and backward in time to determine where stars were positioned in the distant past or where they will be positioned in the distant future. And these are not trivial calculations, even with modern mathematics and computers. Yet the evidence suggests that prehistoric peoples not only made these calculations, but considered them important enough to encode permanently in massive stone monuments that required enormous investments of labor to construct, suggesting that astronomical knowledge served some purpose that we may not fully understand, perhaps related to timekeeping on scales far longer than agricultural seasons, perhaps related to predicting or commemorating catastrophic events, perhaps related to functions that have been completely lost to modern understanding. The astronomical alignments found at sacred sites around the world display a consistency that suggests either independent discovery of the same astronomical principles by multiple cultures, which would require each culture to conduct centuries of observations and mathematical analysis, or transmission of astronomical knowledge from a common source, and the evidence increasingly points toward the latter explanation, toward the existence of a sophisticated astronomical tradition that predates the civilizations we know from history, a tradition that understood the heavens with remarkable precision, and that encoded this understanding in monuments designed to survive for millennia. And when we map the distribution of these astronomically aligned sites across the globe, from Stonehenge in England to the pyramids of Egypt, from Nabta Playa in the Sahara to temples in Mexico and Peru, from Göbekli Tepe in Turkey to stone circles in Scotland and Ireland, we see a pattern of knowledge distribution that suggests either remarkable coincidence or some form of cultural contact or knowledge transmission that occurred in the prehistoric period, connecting peoples who supposedly had no contact with each other, and transmitting astronomical knowledge that each culture then preserved in the only way they could, by building monuments that would speak to the future about what they knew. The next chapter will examine the catastrophic event that may explain why this ancient astronomical knowledge appears in fragments, why the maps show ice-free coastlines that shouldn't exist, why the precision stoneworking suggests capabilities that were lost and only partially recovered. Because approximately 12,800 years ago, something happened to Earth that appears in the geological record as a sudden and dramatic climate shift, that appears in ice cores as chemical signatures of massive fires and atmospheric disruption, and that appears in the mythologies of cultures around the world as stories of floods and destruction and the ending of a previous world. And this event, whatever it was, may have destroyed the civilization that created the maps and built the astronomically aligned monuments and developed the precision stoneworking techniques, leaving only scattered survivors who attempted to preserve what knowledge they could in stone and symbol and story, creating the mysterious technological anomalies that confound our neat timeline of human development and suggest that civilization is far older and far more fragile than we have dared to imagine. Dr. Richard Firestone sat in his office at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in 2006, examining data from ice core samples extracted from the Greenland ice sheet. And what he saw in the chemical composition of the ice layer dated to approximately 12,800 years ago should not have existed in a world where human civilization developed peacefully and progressively from simple hunter-gatherers to complex urban societies. Because the ice from this specific layer contained unusual concentrations of platinum, iridium, and other elements rare in Earth's crust, but common in asteroids and comets, along with microscopic diamonds called nanodiamonds that only form under conditions of extreme heat and pressure, such as those created by extraterrestrial impacts. And perhaps most tellingly, the ice contained high concentrations of carbon spherules and a black matte layer that suggested massive wildfires burning across entire continents. Wildfires so extensive that their smoke and ash circled the globe and left a signature in the ice that remains detectable more than 12,000 years later. And this evidence, combined with similar findings from sediment cores taken from dozens of sites across North America, Europe, and Asia, pointed toward a conclusion that was almost too terrible to contemplate. that Earth had been struck by fragments of a disintegrating comet around 12,800 years ago, triggering what geologists call the Younger Dryas climate event, a sudden return to Ice Age conditions that lasted for more than 1,000 years and that would have been catastrophic for any human civilizations that existed at that time. The Younger Dryas event appears in the geological record as a sharp boundary, a distinct layer where pollen from warm climate plants suddenly disappears and is replaced by pollen from cold-adapted species, where the sediment changes color and composition, where the remains of large mammals that had survived for thousands of years suddenly vanish from the fossil record. And this boundary, this moment of planetary catastrophe, coincides suspiciously well with the time period when, according to the evidence we've examined in previous chapters, there should have been an advanced civilization capable of creating precision stonework, conducting global surveys, and encoding sophisticated astronomical knowledge in monuments. And the timing of this correlation raises the possibility that has been discussed in academic whispers and alternative history circles for decades, but rarely examined seriously by mainstream science, that there was indeed an advanced prehistoric civilization, that it was destroyed by the Younger Dryas catastrophe, and that what we call the beginning of civilization in Sumer and Egypt and the Indus Valley represents not the first emergence of human sophistication, but rather a rebuilding recovery, a desperate attempt by survivors to preserve and transmit the knowledge of a world that had been lost. The impact hypothesis, developed by Firestone and his colleagues, including geophysicist Alan West and nuclear chemist Wendy Wolbach, suggests that Earth passed through the debris field of a fragmenting comet around 12,800 years ago. And while most of the fragments burned up in the atmosphere or fell into the oceans, several large pieces struck the North American ice sheet, the impact explosions generating temperatures hot enough to instantly vaporize ice and create pressure waves that would have been felt around the world, melting massive quantities of glacial ice in a matter of hours or days, sending walls of water rushing across the landscape, raising sea levels by potentially hundreds of feet in a geological instant, drowning coastal settlements, obliterating river valleys, fundamentally redrawing the map of human habitation. And the heat from these impacts and the resulting fires would have incinerated forests across continents, filled the atmosphere with smoke and ash that blocked sunlight for years, triggered a rapid cooling that sent Earth plunging back into Ice Age conditions just when the previous Ice Age had been ending, creating a climatic catastrophe that would have made survival difficult even for small bands of mobile hunter-gatherers, and potentially impossible for any settled civilizations that might have existed. The mythological record, that vast collection of stories and legends that cultures around the world have preserved for thousands of years, contains accounts of catastrophic floods and cosmic disasters that appear with suspicious consistency across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. And while mainstream anthropology has traditionally dismissed these flood myths as either independent responses to local flooding events or as universal psychological archetypes representing human fears of chaos and destruction, the sheer number and similarity of these accounts suggests another possibility: that they represent genuine cultural memories of a real catastrophic event. Memories that were preserved in oral tradition for thousands of years before being written down. And when we examine these flood myths closely, we find details that correlate remarkably well with what we would expect from the kind of catastrophic flooding that would result from rapid glacial melting following a comet impact, including descriptions of waters rising from the ocean and falling from the sky simultaneously, of darkness covering the world, of fire raining down, of the stars falling from their positions, and of a previous world or previous age of humanity being destroyed with only a few survivors remaining to rebuild civilization. The biblical account of Noah's flood is perhaps the most famous of these deluge myths in Western culture. But it is far from unique, because the Sumerians had their own flood story, featuring a hero named Utnapishtim, who survived by building a great boat. The ancient Greeks had the story of Deucalion and the flood sent by Zeus to destroy humanity. The Hindu Puranas describe a flood that Manu survived with the help of a fish avatar of Vishnu. Chinese mythology includes accounts of catastrophic floods in the time before recorded history. And indigenous peoples of the Americas, from the Pacific Northwest to the Amazon basin, preserve stories of a time when the waters rose and destroyed the previous world. And the global distribution of these myths, the consistency of their basic narrative elements, despite vast geographical and temporal distances between the cultures that preserved them, suggests that we are dealing not with pure mythology, but with cultural memory of actual events. Events so traumatic and so fundamental to human survival that they were preserved in story form across hundreds of generations, passed from grandparent to grandchild, around fires and in ceremonies, maintaining a core narrative stability even as specific details were adapted to local cultural contexts. Graham Hancock, the journalist and alternative history researcher whose work has been simultaneously influential in popular culture and reviled by academic archaeologists, has spent decades examining the evidence for what he calls a lost civilization of the Ice Age. And while his theories have been criticized for making connections that mainstream archaeology considers speculative or unsupported, his fundamental observation remains difficult to dismiss: that the sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge and capabilities in civilizations like ancient Egypt and Sumer looks exactly like what we would expect to see if survivors of an earlier advanced civilization were attempting to preserve and transmit their knowledge after most of their population and infrastructure had been destroyed. And this observation gains credibility when we examine the geological evidence for rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, because the flooding caused by melting ice sheets would have been catastrophic for any coastal settlements. And if prehistoric peoples had developed maritime civilizations, as the maps we examined in Chapter 3 suggest they had, then these civilizations would have been concentrated in coastal areas that are now hundreds of feet underwater, their cities and harbors and monuments drowned beneath the waves, accessible only to marine archaeologists, who have only begun to explore the submerged landscapes that were dry land during the Ice Age. The genetic evidence for prehistoric catastrophe appears in human DNA as what population geneticists call bottlenecks, periods when the global human population dropped dramatically, reducing genetic diversity in ways that remain detectable tens of thousands of years later. And while the most famous of these bottlenecks occurred around 70,000 years ago, possibly triggered by the massive eruption of Virgin, the Toba supervolcano in Indonesia, genetic studies also show evidence of population reductions around 12,000 years ago, coinciding suspiciously well with the Younger Dryas event. And these population bottlenecks suggest that humanity has come perilously close to extinction multiple times in our history. That the survivors of these catastrophes carried forward only a fraction of the genetic diversity and presumably only a fraction of the cultural knowledge that existed before the disasters struck. And if we apply this understanding to the question of lost civilizations, we can envision scenarios where sophisticated cultures with accumulated knowledge spanning thousands of years were reduced to small bands of survivors who preserved what they could, but inevitably lost much of the detailed technical knowledge that had required generations to develop. The concept of forbidden archaeology, popularized by researchers like Michael Cremo and Richard Thompson, refers to the observation that archaeological discoveries which don't fit the accepted timeline of human development often face resistance from academic institutions, that papers describing anomalous artifacts or sites may be rejected from journals not because of methodological problems, but because their conclusions challenge established paradigms, that funding for research into alternative theories of human prehistory is difficult or impossible to obtain through conventional academic channels. And while some of this resistance is undoubtedly justified, many alternative theories are indeed based on poor evidence or faulty reasoning. The institutional unwillingness to seriously examine evidence that challenges the standard model has created a situation where the archaeological establishment protects its understanding of history through professional gatekeeping, rather than through open investigation of all available evidence. And this protective mechanism means that artifacts like the precision-machined stone vases of Egypt, the impossible drill cores, the maps showing ice-free Antarctica, and the astronomical alignments encoding knowledge of precession are acknowledged to exist, but are explained away with increasingly elaborate scenarios, rather than being allowed to challenge the fundamental timeline that places Sumer at the beginning of civilization. The alternative timeline that emerges when we take all of this evidence seriously, when we allow the precision stonework and the ancient maps and the astronomical alignments and the geological evidence of catastrophe to inform our understanding of human history, suggests a narrative that is far more complex and far more humbling than the standard model. A narrative in which anatomically modern humans, possessing the same cognitive capabilities that we have today, developed sophisticated civilizations not once, but multiple times across the hundreds of thousands of years since our species emerged. Civilizations that rose and flourished during favorable climatic periods, that accumulated knowledge and developed technologies that allowed them to create the impossible artifacts we've examined, that conducted global surveys and built monuments encoding their astronomical wisdom, but that were vulnerable to the same geological and cosmic forces that periodically devastate Earth. And when these catastrophes struck, when comets impacted, or supervolcanoes erupted, or ice sheets collapsed and flooded the coasts, these civilizations were destroyed, their cities drowned or buried, their populations reduced to small bands of survivors who carried forward fragments of knowledge, but who could not maintain the complex social structures and technical capabilities that had produced the great achievements of their ancestors. In this alternative narrative, what we see in ancient Sumer around 3500 BCE is not the first emergence of writing and mathematics and sophisticated urban organization, but rather the re-emergence of these capabilities after a dark age that lasted more than 1,000 years following the Younger Dryas catastrophe. A rebuilding phase where survivors of the earlier civilization, or their descendants, finally recovered enough population and stability to begin establishing cities again, to begin recording knowledge in permanent form again, to begin building monuments again. And the reason that Sumerian civilization appears already sophisticated, already possessing advanced mathematical concepts and astronomical knowledge and architectural capabilities, is that they were working from a template, consciously or unconsciously, following patterns established by their predecessors, attempting to preserve knowledge that had been passed down through oral tradition or through symbolic systems encoded in monuments, knowledge that they may not have fully understood, but that they recognized as valuable and worth preserving. The survivors of any catastrophic collapse of civilization face a profound dilemma in terms of knowledge preservation, because the most sophisticated knowledge, the kind that requires specialized training and complex infrastructure to understand and use, is also the most fragile, the most likely to be lost when the institutions and social structures that support it collapse. And so survivors must make choices about what to preserve and how to preserve it. And the evidence suggests that prehistoric survivors chose to encode the most important knowledge in the most permanent medium available to them, which was stone monuments aligned to astronomical positions. Monuments that could serve as both calendars and as repositories of astronomical data. Monuments that would survive even if the civilizations that built them did not. And this explains why we find astronomical alignments at sites around the world. Why these alignments encode knowledge of precession and other long-term celestial cycles. Why the monuments were built with such massive stones and such careful precision. Because their builders knew that they were creating not just religious sites or burial chambers, but time capsules. Messages to the future, attempts to ensure that hard-won astronomical knowledge would not be completely lost, even if their civilization failed to survive. The fragility of civilization, which the COVID-19 pandemic and various natural disasters of recent years have made uncomfortably apparent, even to those of us living in the technologically advanced 21st century, should make us more sympathetic to the possibility that sophisticated prehistoric civilizations could have been destroyed by catastrophes. Because we can see how quickly social order breaks down when supply chains are disrupted, how dependent our complex technology is on intricate networks of specialists and infrastructure, how much knowledge would be lost if modern universities and research institutions and data centers were suddenly destroyed and only small bands of survivors remained. And if we can imagine this scenario happening to our civilization, despite all our technology and global communications, then we should be able to imagine similar scenarios befalling prehistoric civilizations that possessed sophisticated knowledge and capabilities, but that lacked the population numbers and geographical distribution and technological resilience to survive major catastrophes. The story that the evidence tells, when we allow ourselves to really listen to what the artifacts and the geological record and the mythological accounts are saying, is not a story of steady, linear progress from primitive to advanced. Not a story of civilization beginning in one place at one time and gradually spreading across the world, but rather a story of cycles, of knowledge gained and lost and partially recovered, of civilizations that rose and fell, and whose ruins and artifacts and preserved fragments of knowledge became the foundation for later civilizations. And this cyclical view of history, this understanding that human capability and human knowledge have waxed and waned across the millennia rather than following a simple upward trajectory, is both humbling and frightening, because it suggests that civilization is far more fragile than we like to believe, that the knowledge and capabilities we think of as secure can be lost in a generation or two if the social structures that preserve and transmit them are disrupted, and that we may be living through only the latest iteration of a pattern that has repeated itself many times in human history. We stand now at a crossroads in our understanding of human history, faced with a choice between maintaining the comfortable consensus that civilization began with Sumer and everything before was primitive simplicity, or accepting the implications of the evidence we've examined across these 5 chapters, accepting that human history is far longer and far more complex than we've been taught, that capabilities we think of as modern have existed before, that knowledge we think of as recent has been discovered and lost and rediscovered across tens of thousands of years, and that the impossible artifacts and ancient knowledge that challenge our timeline are not anomalies to be explained away, but rather windows into a past that we have barely begun to understand, a past that holds lessons about both the heights that human civilization can reach and the depths to which it can fall. And perhaps, if we are wise enough to really listen to what the evidence is telling us, lessons that might help us avoid the catastrophes that destroyed our predecessors, and ensure that our own civilization's knowledge survives whatever challenges the future may bring.